You know how the 1995 adaptation of Persuasion begins with everybody gathered in a room at Kellynch Hall, talking about Sir Walter's finances? That exact situation never actually takes place in the book, but the script is still extremely close to the original text. That's because in Chapter 2 of Persuasion, Jane Austen uses free indirect discourse to compress time, move the story forward, and hold a debate among her characters, all while barely using any dialogue. We've got to talk about how she does it. Hi, everybody. My name is Rosie. I'm a writer, editor, and crocheter, and today I am making a sweater and reading Persuasion. I'm new here on YouTube, so it almost feels a little bit weird to say welcome to my channel. Instead, I kind of want to say thank you for having me. But either way, I am so happy you're here. This is a space where we read and discuss classic literature while also working on handmade projects. I think handicrafts have a lot in common with the craft of writing, and also I really like to read books or watch videos while I crochet. So if that's something you like to do too, please consider subscribing. I would love to keep you and your project's company. And if you're working on something right now while you're watching, please drop a comment and let us all know how it's going. When we left off with Chapter 1 of Persuasion, we had met the Elliot family and learned about their debts. Sir Walter and his daughter Elizabeth had called on two confidential friends, Lady Russell and Mr. Shepherd, to help them get out of debt without cutting back on any luxuries. Today we'll be going back in with Chapter 2, so if you haven't seen my video for Chapter 1, please do go ahead and watch that first, and I'll meet you back here in a bit. Just like before, I'm going to read the chapter out loud and then have a little discussion, but because I think this chapter is structured in a really interesting way, I first want to share a bit about free indirect discourse so that we can all know what to watch for when we're reading. Free indirect discourse, also known as free indirect speech or free indirect style, is a literary technique where a third-person narrator takes on the voice of one of the characters in order to describe their thoughts. So if you imagine the narrator sort of watching the story unfold from above or from a distance, free indirect discourse would be not just zooming in on one of the characters, but actually turning the camera to look through that person's eyes. And that's my quick and dirty definition. There are a lot of really good videos here on YouTube that go into it in more depth. I'll link a couple of those in the description. But what I want to do now is to show you how it operates in this chapter. As I read, I'm going to put up a note on the screen every time the narrator shifts into someone else's perspective, and you'll probably also hear me change my intonation slightly to distinguish that character's voice. And of course, you're always welcome to skip to the analysis using the timestamps below. Whoops, hi. Editing Rosie here, and I just realized that I completely forgot to talk about something very important, which is the close third-person perspective. So remember that camera analogy from a second ago? Let's say a third-person narrator is watching from a distance. Rosie sat crocheting, not realizing that she forgot to mention something important. A close third person is that zoomed-in position where the narrator has access to the character's thoughts, but they're still filtered through the narrator's voice, often with a third-person pronoun and a verb to introduce them. Gradually, Rosie began to realize that something was missing. She had hoped her script was complete, but something nagged at her. She wondered what it was. With free indirect discourse, you go even closer. Sometimes those little designations like she thought will sort of melt away and you'll get the character's voice completely unfiltered. But other times, even if a phrase like she thought or she believed is still there, you can spot this kind of style because of words or speech patterns that sound like the person's voice. What was it? She knew there was something. She was just thinking, oh damn, close third person, alas. Now, the reason this is important is actually the same reason I forgot about it. As you just saw in my very heavy-handed example, a narrator will often transition into free indirect discourse through a close third person, which is part of what makes this technique feel so natural and what makes it so effective, right? Free indirect discourse works like empathy. You get up close and personal with somebody, and before you know it, you're starting to speak their language. But it also means that when I mark a shift in perspective, like I planned, that perspective shift is often going to start in a close third person. So in addition to the notes on screen, I'm also going to use the zoom function and see if that can help us demonstrate how the narrator is getting into the characters' heads. And as a disclaimer, I recognize that some of the passages I'll identify as free indirect discourse, as opposed to a close third person, might be debatable, but in some ways that subtlety is kind of the point, and that's why I think it's useful to go through the whole chapter and see it in practice. And in the analysis section, we will take a closer look at one of Austen's free indirect discourse passages to break down how it's working. Back to the video. Ready? Here we go. Chapter 2. Mr. Shepherd, a civil, cautious lawyer, who, whatever might be his hold or his views on Sir Walter, would rather have the disagreeable prompted by anybody else, excused himself from offering the slightest hint, and only begged leave to recommend an implicit deference to the excellent judgment of Lady Russell, from whose known good sense he fully expected to have just such resolute measures advised as he meant to see finally adopted. Lady Russell was most anxiously zealous on the subject, and gave it much serious consideration. She was a woman rather of sound than of quick abilities, whose difficulties in coming to any decision in this instance were great, from the opposition of two leading principles. She was of strict integrity herself, with a delicate sense of honor, but she was as desirous of saving Sir Walter's feelings, as solicitous for the credit of the family, as aristocratic in her ideas of what was due to them, as anybody of sense and honesty could well be. She was a benevolent, charitable, good woman, and capable of strong attachments, most correct in her conduct, strict in her notions of decorum, and with manners that were held a standard of good breeding. She had a cultivated mind, and was, generally speaking, rational and consistent. But she had prejudices on the side of ancestry. She had a value for rank and consequence, which blinded her a little to the faults of those who possessed them. Herself the widow of only a knight, she gave the dignity of a baronet all its due. And Sir Walter, independent of his claims as an old acquaintance, an attentive neighbour, an obliging landlord, the husband of her very dear friend, the father of Anne and her sisters, was, as being Sir Walter, in her apprehension entitled to a great deal of compassion and consideration under his present difficulties. They must retrench, that did not admit of a doubt. But she was very anxious to have it done with the least possible pain to him and Elizabeth. She drew up plans of economy, she made exact calculations, and she did what nobody else thought of doing. She consulted Anne, who never seemed considered by the others as having any interest in the question. She consulted, and in a degree was influenced by her, in marking out the scheme of retrenchment, which was at last submitted to Sir Walter. Every emendation of Anne's had been on the side of honesty against importance. She wanted more vigorous measures, a more complete reformation, a quicker release from debt, a much higher tone of indifference, for everything but justice and equity. "If we can persuade your father to all this," said Lady Russell, looking over her paper, "much may be done. If he will adopt these regulations, in 7 years he will be clear, and I hope we may be able to convince him and Elizabeth that Kellynch Hall has a respectability in itself, which cannot be affected by these reductions, and that the true dignity of Sir Walter Elliot will be very far from lessened, in the eyes of sensible people, by his acting like a man of principle. What will he be doing, in fact, but what very many of our first families have done, or ought to do? There will be nothing singular in his case, and it is singularity which often makes the worst part of our suffering, as it always does of our conduct. I have great hope of our prevailing. We must be serious and decided, for after all, the person who has contracted debts must pay them, and though a great deal is due to the feelings of the gentleman and the head of the house, like your father, there is still more due to the character of an honest man." This was the principle on which Anne wanted her father to be proceeding, his friends to be urging him. She considered it as an act of indispensable duty to clear away the claims of creditors, with all the expedition which the most comprehensive retrenchments could secure, and saw no dignity in anything short of it. She wanted it to be prescribed and felt as a duty. She rated Lady Russell's influence highly, and as to the severe degree of self-denial which her own conscience prompted, She believed there might be little more difficulty in persuading them to a complete than to half a reformation. Her knowledge of her father and Elizabeth inclined her to think that the sacrifice of one pair of horses would be hardly less painful than of both, and so on, through the whole list of Lady Russell's too gentle reductions. How Anne's more rigid requisitions might have been taken is of little consequence. Lady Russell's had no success at all, could not be put up with, were not to be borne. What? Every comfort of life knocked off? Journeys, London, servants, horses, table, contractions and restrictions everywhere. To live no longer with the decencies even of a private gentleman. No, he would sooner quit Kellynch Hall at once than remain in it on such disgraceful terms. Quit Kellynch Hall! The hint was immediately taken up by Mr. Shepherd, whose interest was involved in the reality of Sir Walter's retrenching, and who was perfectly persuaded that nothing would be done without a change of abode. Since the idea had been started in the very quarter which ought to dictate, he had no scruple, he said, in confessing his judgment to be entirely on that side. It did not appear to him that Sir Walter could materially alter his style of living in a house which had such a character of hospitality and ancient dignity to support. In any other place, Sir Walter might judge for himself, and would be looked up to as regulating the modes of life, in whatever way he might choose to model his household. Sir Walter would quit Kellynch Hall, and after a very few days more of doubt and indecision, the great question of whither he should go was settled, and the first outline of this important change made out. There had been 3 alternatives: London, Bath, or another house in the country. All Anne's wishes had been for the latter. A small house in their own neighbourhood, where they might still have Lady Russell's society, still be near Mary, and still have the pleasure of sometimes seeing the lawns and groves of Kellynch, was the object of her ambition. But the usual fate of Anne attended her, in having something very opposite from her inclination fixed on. She disliked Bath, and did not think it agreed with her, and Bath was to be her home. Sir Walter had at first thought more of London, but Mr. Shepherd felt that he could not be trusted in London, and had been skilful enough to dissuade him from it, and make Bath preferred. It was a much safer place for a gentleman in his predicament. He might there be important at comparatively little expense. 2 material advantages of Bath over London had of course been given all their weight. Its more convenient distance from Kellynch, only 50 miles, and Lady Russell spending some part of every winter there, and to the very great satisfaction of Lady Russell, whose first views on the projected change had been for Bath, Sir Walter and Elizabeth were induced to believe that they should lose neither consequence nor enjoyment by settling there. Lady Russell felt obliged to oppose her dear Anne's known wishes. It would be too much to expect Sir Walter to descend into a small house in his own neighbourhood. Anne herself would have found the mortifications of it more than she foresaw, and to Sir Walter's feelings they must have been dreadful. And with regard to Anne's dislike of Bath, she considered it as a prejudice and mistake, arising first from the circumstance of her having been 3 years at school there, after her mother's death, and secondly, from her happening to be not in perfectly good spirits the only winter which she had afterwards spent there with herself. Lady Russell was fond of Bath, in short, and disposed to think it must suit them all. And as to her young friend's health, by passing all the warm months with her at Kellynch Lodge, every danger would be avoided, and it was, in fact, a change which must do both health and spirits good. Anne had been too little from home, too little seen. Her spirits were not high. A larger society would improve them. She wanted her to be more known. The undesirableness of any other house in the same neighbourhood for Sir Walter was certainly much strengthened by one part, and a very material part of the scheme, which had been happily engrafted on the beginning. He was not only to quit his home, but to see it in the hands of others, a trial of fortitude which stronger heads than Sir Walter's have found too much. Kellynch Hall was to be let. This, however, was a profound secret, not to be breathed beyond their own circle, Sir Walter could not have borne the degradation of being known to design letting his house. Mr. Shepherd had once mentioned the word advertise, but never dared approach it again. Sir Walter spurned the idea of its being offered in any manner, forbade the slightest hint being dropped of his having such an intention, and it was only on the supposition of his being spontaneously solicited by some most unexceptionable applicant on his own terms, and as a great favour, that he would let it at all. How quick come the reasons for approving what we like! Lady Russell had another excellent one at hand, for being extremely glad that Sir Walter and his family were to remove from the country. Elizabeth had been lately forming an intimacy which she wished to see interrupted. It was with a daughter of Mr. Shepherd, who had returned, after an unprosperous marriage, to her father's house with the additional burthen of 2 children. She was a clever young woman who understood the art of pleasing, at least, at Kellynch Hall, and who had made herself so acceptable to Miss Elliot as to have been already staying there more than once, in spite of all that Lady Russell, who thought it a friendship quite out of place, could hint of caution and reserve. Lady Russell, indeed, had scarcely any influence with Elizabeth, and seemed to love her rather because she would love her than because Elizabeth deserved it. She had never received from her more than outward attention, nothing beyond the observances of complaisance, had never succeeded in any point which she wanted to carry, against previous inclination. She had been repeatedly very earnest in trying to get Anne included in the visit to London, sensibly open to all the injustice and all the discredit of the selfish arrangements which shut her out, and on many lesser occasions had endeavoured to give Elizabeth the advantage of her own better judgment and experience. But always in vain. Elizabeth would go her own way, and never had she pursued it in more decided opposition to Lady Russell than in this selection of Mrs. Clay, turning from the society of so deserving a sister to bestow her affection and confidence on one who ought to have been nothing to her but the object of distant civility. From situation, Mrs. Clay was, in Lady Russell's estimate, a very unequal, and in her character she believed a very dangerous companion, and a removal that would leave Mrs. Clay behind, and bring a choice of more suitable intimates within Miss Elliot's reach, was therefore an object of first-rate importance. Do you see what I mean about a debate without any dialogue? We just heard the viewpoints of Mr. Shepherd, Lady Russell, Anne, and Sir Walter in turn. We even heard their voices, and it really felt like a conversation. But it's actually a narrative, just telling the story of thoughts instead of events. It's all seamlessly woven together, and the transitions between the narrator's voice and those of the characters can be hard to spot. So to get a sense of how they happen up close, let's take a look at this couple of sentences where the narrator moves into Sir Walter's voice. How Anne's more rigid requisitions might have been taken is of little consequence. Lady Russell's had no success at all, could not be put up with, were not to be borne. All the way up to the first M-dash, the narrator is giving a pretty straightforward report of what happened, but with that dash, there's a shift into more emotional language, not to mention emotional punctuation, since the dashes are giving this kind of like shocked, heavy breathing effect. Even though it's not spelled out, it's clear Sir Walter is the one who can't put up with the restrictions. Almost all of the chapter is in that mode. If I'm counting right, there are only 2 speech tags, that is, moments where Austen uses he said or she said to mark that somebody is speaking. And in both of those cases, there are other textual elements that, in my opinion, set the speech apart from regular dialogue. First, we have this long paragraph from Lady Russell, who's apparently talking to Anne, but because Anne doesn't respond in dialogue and we don't get any details anchoring their conversation to a particular moment, the effect is still very similar to free and direct discourse in that Lady Russell's thoughts are being narrated in this kind of like timeless, placeless way where they might as well just still be inside her head. There's also this exchange between Sir Walter and Mr. Shepherd, where both of them have speeches that are in quotation marks, so these are things they said out loud, but they're being reported in third person by the narrator. So instead of Mr. Shepherd saying, "I have no scruple in confessing my judgment," we get, "He had no scruple in confessing his judgment." This is like free and direct discourse turned inside out, where instead of narration slipping into a character's voice, we get dialogue slipping into the narrator's voice. And the effect is once again to interrupt the immediacy that dialogue would otherwise have, and to move this conversation into narration, outside of a specific time and place. I think this way of presenting the characters' perspectives, primarily in free and direct discourse, works in 3 different ways. Number 1, there's a time compression to move the story forward. These conversations are probably taking place over days or weeks in the characters' lives, where first Mr. Shepherd is talking to Lady Russell, so she talks with Anne before going to talk to Sir Walter, and he rejects her plans, but then he goes to talk to Mr. Shepherd. But instead of that long play-by-play, we get a narrative timeline that's much more streamlined. Number 2, when the characters' differing views are placed side by side in narration, it helps to highlight how they are in tension or conflict with each other. And number 3, it lets the reader understand that conflict in a way that the characters can't. Earlier, I was making a big deal out of how the chapter feels like a conversation. But the fact is it's not a conversation. These characters are not necessarily communicating with each other. They're talking to each other, but because everything is reported in free and direct discourse, it's not always clear where the out loud thoughts end and the inside thoughts begin. For instance, we know Anne doesn't like Bath and doesn't think it agrees with her, but it's not clear how forcefully or effectively she has expressed that to her family. She might even have decided, like, hey, nobody listens to me, I might as well not mention it at all. So in this way, free and direct discourse both hides and highlights the ways in which the characters are not on the same page. And in allowing the reader to experience this uncertainty, this whole like, wait, I thought that was communicated, but maybe it wasn't, in creating that effect, I think the chapter is very subtly setting us up for an exploration of what people communicate externally versus what they hide. So in Chapter 3, we're going to continue that exploration via what's almost the direct opposite of this kind of style, with long blocks of dialogue, a real focus on what's happening externally in the moment, and some very important thoughts that we pointedly do not have access to. But that's a subject for our next video. On a different note, I have one last detail I want to talk about before we go, and that is this line about Lady Russell's relationship with Elizabeth. Quote, Lady Russell had scarcely any influence with Elizabeth, and seemed to love her rather because she would love her than because Elizabeth deserved it. I am super interested in the mention of influence here. Let me know if you agree about this, but it sounds to me like Austen is making a connection between the ability to be loved and the ability to be persuaded. The implication in this case is that Elizabeth would better deserve to be loved by Lady Russell if she would just listen to her, which honestly does make sense. But there's also a lot of vulnerability in being persuadable, and it can come into conflict with other forms of love. I mean, look at Mr. Bingley, right? He cares a lot about his sisters and Mr. Darcy, so he's easily persuaded by them, and it leads to him just abandoning Jane. So I don't know. What do you think about the relationship between love and persuasion in Jane Austen's work? Please do leave a comment and let me know. I'm really excited to hear what you think. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or subscribing. It will really mean a lot to me, and also if you subscribe, you'll be able to get notified when I post the next chapter. So for now, happy reading, happy crafting, and I'll see you in Chapter 3.